The first thing he noticed was not the sunset, though the sky burned red like a field on fire. It was her, a young woman, standing there in a ripped pale dress, wrists cinched hard with rope. Her face was streaked with blood and grit, her body mapped by lashes that had carved deeper than skin. The wind worried at her hair, but her eyes were void, the kind that told you life had already gone somewhere else. Now ask yourself this. What would you do if you walked into that sight? A stranger asking for death, her voice dry as dust, her spirit already gone. Would you pass by, telling yourself it wasn't your trouble, or would you step forward, knowing that by doing so you might inherit every scrap of her suffering? The desert didn't hand out answers, only quiet. It was 1886 out in the Red Mesa country of New Mexico, a stretch where the law rode slow and wickedness moved fast. Men wrote their own rules, and the fragile were often left to die alone. Jonah Reddick, a cattleman of 48, had buried his wife Lila 6 years before with his own hands. Since then, he'd lived quiet, pushing stock, drinking black coffee, and carrying the freight of his memories. He figured he had seen all the ways life could break a man. But when he found her, he learned he had not seen everything. She lifted her head just enough to catch his gaze. Her lips were split, her voice nothing more than a rasp carried on the wind. Just kill me. That was all. No pleading, no tears, no fight left inside her. It wasn't a supplication. It was surrender. She wasn't asking him to be kind. She was asking him to end the emptiness. Jonah stood rooted, the bite of those words pressing against recollections he had locked away. He had heard death in plenty of forms, on skirmish lines, in fever rooms, on the long nights when men lost their will to hang on. But never like this, never from someone so young. Wearing what had once been the color of innocence, now shredded and ruined, he drew his knife, the steel catching the last blaze of the evening. The girl didn't flinch. For a heartbeat, she seemed sure he would give her what she wanted. Instead, he leaned in and sliced through the raw hide, digging into her wrists. Her body folded forward, light as dry, kindling in his arms as he steadied her. Something slipped from the folds of her ruined dress. A letter, crumpled and smeared with blood, sealed once with red wax, now broken. Jonah caught it before it hit the dirt. He turned it in his hand, but didn't open it. There would be time for that. For now, the only truth that mattered was the faint breath still clinging to her chest. He lifted her onto his horse, the animal shifting under the added weight. The desert stretched in every direction, silent and merciless. The trail back to his spread would be long, and night was already climbing. But Jonah knew one thing. He wasn't leaving her there to die. Not in that dress. Not with those scars. Not with those words ringing in his ears. As he swung up and turned for home, the last light slipped behind a rimrock. Darkness crept quick across the land, and with it came questions no man could ignore. Who had left her like this? Why was she marked by cruelty so deliberate? And what secret lay curled inside that blood-stained note? This wasn't just a rescue. This was the start of a reckoning. And for anyone watching, the only choice left was to stay and see where the trail would lead, because the truth inside that letter was about to split open the silence of the frontier. The ride back to the ranch was slow and heavy. The girl hardly moved in the saddle, her head resting against Jonah like she was perched between this world and the next. He laid her on the old bed, the one Lila used to keep by the window. He drew water from the well, washed the blood and dust from her face, and bandaged the worst of the cuts with torn cloth. He didn't press her. Sometimes silence shouts louder than words. Most men would have walked away, told themselves it wasn't their burden, but Jonah stayed. And maybe you wonder, would you have done the same? The dress she wore was nothing but shreds now. So Jonah went to the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. Inside, folded and untouched for years, was one of Lila's old dresses. Soft blue, plain, nothing fancy. He hesitated, his rough hands snagging on the fabric. But in the end, he sat on the chair by the bed. When she woke, if she woke, she wouldn't have to wear rags. He sat by the table, the lantern throwing shadows across the boards. His eyes kept drifting back to the letter he'd plucked from the dirt. Blood had soaked into the paper. The red wax was broken. He hadn't opened it. Not yet. A man doesn't rush into trouble when he already knows it's waiting. As the night dragged on, Jonah listened to the sound of her breathing. Slow, uneven, but still there. He thought of Lila and realized this girl had hummed something, too, before she collapsed. Broken, nearly gone, but familiar. And that is where the story cinches its grip, because the girl wasn't just a victim hauled from the sand. She carried a secret, one that tied her fate to men far more dangerous than Jonah could yet reckon. She slept through most of the next day, her body too weak to do anything but fight for each breath. By the time the sun slid low again, Jonah knew he couldn't keep her hidden in that weather-beaten house. She needed medicine, real food, and clothes that didn't carry memories that belonged to someone else. That meant one thing, a trip in a dry creek. Jonah saddled up, helped her into the wagon, and kept her close under a shawl. She was quiet, her eyes darting now and then like she expected someone to step out of the shade. By the time they rattled into town, the street was humming. Jonah guided the team to the general store. For a little while, it felt almost ordinary. He traded for flour, salt, fresh bandages. The clerk gave a brief nod. Nothing more. But trouble doesn't request permission. It arrived the moment they stepped out onto the boardwalk. A man lounged against the hitch rail, hat slung low, smile too wide. Mason Pike. Folks in town called him a cowhand, but Jonah had seen his kind before. Cruel for the sport of it. His eyes fixed on the girl. "Well now, ain't this a notion?" Mason drawled, stepping forward. "Thought you were long gone. Guess the boys at camp didn't finish the job." The girl went still. Jonah felt her grip tighten on his sleeve. Mason reached as if to strip the shawl from her shoulders. That was when Jonah moved. He hit Mason square across the jaw, the crack echoing down the street. Mason reeled, spitting blood, his hand flying to the pistol at his hip. Jonah had his revolver out before the crowd even breathed. The barrel held steady, his eyes colder than the steel. "Touch her again," he said low, "and you won't walk away." For a long heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Mason lowered his hand, fury burning his face. "You think this ends here?" he hissed. "Camp will come. She's ours." He spat in the dust and staggered off, clutching his jaw. The cluster of bystanders drifted back, whispering. Some looked with respect, others with worry. The girl said nothing. But when Jonah turned to help her into the wagon, she met his eyes. For the first time, there was something there. Not hope. Not yet, but the faintest spark that maybe she wasn't alone anymore. They rolled out of town with the sun dropping behind the ridge. Jonah kept the reins steady, but inside his chest a long, cold fire woke. He knew what Mason meant. Men like that never forgot an insult. They would come, and when they did, he would be ready. Stories like this are why folks keep listening, because out here on the frontier, every stand for fairness carried a price, and the question was always who would pay it. If you want to keep riding with Jonah and this young woman to see how far this fight for right will reach, now is the time to stay close so you don't miss what comes next. Night dropped heavy over the ranch. The wind moved low through the mesquite, carrying a hush that wasn't natural. Jonah felt it long before he heard sound. Years out here had taught him the land speaks to a man if he's willing to listen. Tonight, the land was whispering trouble. Inside the house, the girl sat by the lantern, her face pale, but her eyes sharper now, tracking every flicker like it was her last comfort. Jonah checked the door, checked the rifle by the window, and stepped onto the porch. The sky was spread wide, stars like dust on black velvet. Somewhere out there, men were riding. He didn't have to wait long. Hooves drummed the hardpan. 3 riders cutting through the dark. They hauled up short of the porch, their horses jittering, their shapes edged by starlight. Mason wasn't with them, but his voice lived in their words. "You got something belongs to us," one called. Jonah leaned against the post, easy as if he were speaking about the weather. "Only things here are cattle and a roof that leaks when it storms." The men shifted in their saddles. Another spoke, his voice iron. She was marked. She was judged. You bring her out, or we'll come in and take her." Jonah let the quiet stretch. Then he stepped off the porch, slow, measured, the kind of walk that makes a man wonder if he's looking at his last mistake. He carried nothing but a lantern in his hand. He led them not toward the house, but toward the old tool shed by the barn. When he pushed the door, the smell of dust and iron rose up. Stacked in a corner sat a crate left over from the war, the wood dark with age. Jonah set the lantern on top, light catching faint stenciled letters, explosives. He turned to the riders, eyes cold. "You head back and tell Mason this spread is off limits. Next step you take, I drop this lantern. None of us walks away." The horses shied. One man swore under his breath. Finally, the leader tugged his reins. "This ain't finished," he spat. "You can't hold out forever." Jonah didn't shift. He just stood there, lantern balanced in his fist, steady as stone. One by one, they wheeled their horses and slid back into the dark, the hoofbeats drifting until the night was quiet again. He let out a long breath, lowered the light, and walked back to the porch. Inside, the girl hadn't moved, but when their eyes met, she gave the smallest nod. Not thanks, not yet, but something closer to belief. Jonah set the lantern on the table, his hand brushing the unopened letter. He knew the fight was far from over. Men like Mason don't forgive. But for tonight, the ranch still stood. The girl still breathed, and the desert silence once more belonged to the crickets and the wind. And that is the kind of stand folks out here remember. Not for the gunfire, but because one man chose to draw the line and dared the world to cross it. Morning came soft after that long night. The place looked the same, the sagging fence, the tired barn, the same low hills fading into dry country. But inside, something had shifted. The girl was alive. The riders had been turned away. For the first time in years, Jonah felt he hadn't just made it through the dark. He'd won something worth keeping. In the days that followed, the girl began to mend. Her name was Raina. At first, she spoke little, her voice thin as thread. But strength crept back. She tended the stove, poured coffee, even set sage by the window where Lila once kept her herbs. Small things, but to Jonah, they were everything. And it makes you think, how many of us notice such small victories in our own lives? He never pushed her to tell what she'd endured. A man who has buried grief knows better than to dig up someone else's. Instead, he showed her the range, the cattle drifting slow across the pasture, the way the San Miguel River sawed through rock, the mesas burning red in the evening light. Piece by piece, the heavy silence between them began to turn into something else, something close to peace. One dusk, as the sun slid low, Jonah heard a sound that froze him in place. Raina was singing. Not much, just a tune carried soft and sure. But it was whole this time, not fractured like before. He stood in the doorway, listening, unwilling to disturb it. It wasn't Lila's song, not exactly, but it carried the same warmth. For Jonah, that little melody was louder than any gunshot he'd heard. It meant hope still lived. In that sound, he understood that healing had started. They never named it love. Folks out here didn't waste words on things too big for language. But it was there. In the way Jonah placed an extra log on the fire each night, in the way Raina folded the blue dress carefully before sleep. One night, after Raina drifted off, Jonah finally reached for the letter he'd carried since the day he found her. The paper was stiff with dried blood, the seal long broken. He unfolded it slow, the lantern light pulling the words from the page. What he read wasn't merely a confession. It was proof. Names of men tied to the camp, dates and signs that what happened to Raina was part of something larger, something that stretched beyond Red Mesa and into the pockets of men who smiled in church on Sundays. Jonah sat a long time, the paper heavy in his calloused hands. Then, without a word, he pulled a fresh envelope, scratched a few lines, and tucked the evidence inside. By sunrise, a rider would be carrying it north to Sheriff Hale in Silver Rock. He didn't sign his name. Some fights a man wages out in the open. Others he wages in quiet, trusting that justice can still find its way through the cracks. Care doesn't always need to be shouted. Sometimes it's strongest in the quiet, staying, guarding, choosing not to run. And maybe that's the lesson this tale leaves behind. Even in a land as unforgiving as the West, kindness still carries weight. Sometimes the bravest stand isn't made with a trigger pull, but with the choice to protect, to tend, to hold the line for someone who can't hold it alone. Now consider this. How many of us would have done what Jonah did? Would we have lifted her from the dust, faced down armed men in the dark, and opened our home to a stranger? Or would we have turned away, telling ourselves it wasn't our fight? If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even the hardest seasons can shelter a spark, let it travel. Tap that like so others can find it. Stay with the channel so you don't miss the next ride into the frontier. These aren't just yarns about guns and grit. They're reminders of what it means to stand upright when the world tries to shove you down. Because in the end, what makes a story last is the way it shows us who we are and who we can choose to be.